Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the International Center Goa for today's public lecture by Shivam Singh on sports law in India. We are delighted to be hosting him to speak on a topic which I know very little about. So, I'll probably end up listening to it and then, coming up with whatever questions I might have. But for students, I think this is a great opportunity. I mean, as we were talking earlier, I was talking earlier to Shivam, and I said, look, it seems like this may be something, which is going to become bigger over the future. Because as sports in India becomes more professionalized, other than cricket, of course, there'll be so many opportunities in the area of sports law. And I think that's the reason why the principal of VM Salgaonkar Law College was keen that you attend this talk. So thank you all for coming. Very, very quick introduction. Shivam Singh read law at the National Law School of India University in Bangalore and at Columbia Law. He was also a visiting researcher at Harvard Law and has taught at several reputed law schools across the country. He has published extensively, including his book. Can I just borrow to show it to the students? Including his 2025 book, Sports Law in India, which I assume is going to become a reference point for anyone doing sports law in India. Congratulations on the book. He has published extensively otherwise as well, and as a lawyer he has represented several sports clubs in a variety of disputes with various regulatory bodies across the country. And you can assume that, again, I'm sure you know that regulation in any sphere, whether it's education, health, sports, is a mind-boggling area. So that's what Shivam does. He represents various sports bodies in their regulatory challenges. Thank you, everyone, for coming once again. And Shivam, welcome to the International Center Goa.
Thank you. Thank you for offering this platform to me. I'd like to thank a lot of people who are here, students who are here, a lot of friends who are here, family who's here, and I'd like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to each and every one of you for taking time out and making it possible to attend this event and for offering this platform to me so that I can speak about this subject area, which is very close to my heart. And I hope that during the course of this session, some of you may develop a slightly deeper interest in sports law. So now, within sports law, I think a lot of people come up with this idea that what exactly is sports law and why sports law. So the simplest way to look at it, and perhaps to me the most correct way to look at it, is that when you're looking at sports law, please think of it as law which is catering to the sports sector, and that will give you an idea about what is really involved and what is really included in this branch of law. Because when it comes to sports law, there are only perhaps two sets of offenses or two categories of cases which are purely sports law cases, and that too borrow heavily from other areas. So the first one would be match fixing, which has an overlap with, say, criminal law, or for that matter with principles of administrative law, or for that matter principles of contract law. Or the other pure sports law dispute would be relating to anti-doping, which is again having an overlap in some form at least with NDPS, so criminal law, or for that matter with contract law, because the contract provides that you cannot indulge in certain kinds of prohibited behavior, and if you do, there are certain sanctions which are involved in it. And these are two integrity offenses which are central to sports law. And the most common distinction, or the most fundamental distinction between the two, is that while both of these are integrity offenses and both of them involve cheating, but both of them involve cheating for very different purposes. So Anti-doping would involve cheating for the fact that you're trying to cheat in a manner to win. Whereas when it comes to match fixing, you're cheating in order to lose. So that's the most crucial and fundamental distinction between this. So the reason why a lot of us are attracted to sports and why a lot of us feel that sports is something which excites us is that in some way or another it offers us an avenue to disconnect from our daily lives, our daily struggles, and in another way it represents a form of excellence because people are pushing their limits to go faster, higher, stronger, citius, altius, fortius. So in that regard, again, sports and sports law have a role which is to be played, and they are forming a part of our journeys. Now, when it comes to sports law, there are different areas within it, and there are different things which have an overlap with it. Now, at any given point of time, please have this understanding that if somebody is coming to you with a sports law problem, they're first coming to you for seeking advice from you because you're a lawyer, and it's only then that because you have an understanding of the sports sector that they're coming to you. And it's your primary training as a lawyer which will equip you to offer them the soundest kind of advice in this regard. So that is the most crucial thing that I would like to impress upon all of you. Now, the growth of this subject area within India has been glacial for a long period of time, and for decades you did not have any kind of legislation which came about to regulate the space. But then again, within a period of say 2 weeks, a month ago, you had two absolutely game-changing legislations which came about. The first one was that relating to the Sports Governance Act, and the second one was which was the Prohibition of Gaming Relating Regulation Act. Now, in these contexts, you'd find that the entire sports ecosystem which had been built in a particular manner underwent a significant amount of change because of these legislations. And if you have to understand how legislations have an impact upon the entire ecosystem, then you cannot do it by only having a narrow focus on sports, because you'll have to understand this by understanding how administrative law principles work, how constitutional law principles work, how businesses operate, how commerce operates, and most importantly as to how regulators and the governments think. So that is what will offer you a bit of a blueprint into how sports law generally tends to operate. Now, if you just look at cases around you and if you just look at examples around you, you'd find that sports law which is growing and the sports sector which is growing in a manner because you see that all these broadcasters and all these sponsors are seeing that people are so heavily invested in sports that they would offer a premium to watch these events. And in fact, we are here in Goa. Goa is one of the states which, contrary to the rest of India, is not an entirely cricket-dominated state. For instance, Goa is one of the few states where possibly at any given point in time there would be more takers for football than there would be for cricket. So Goa offers a very interesting and a very distinct opportunity for sports and how sports can grow within India. Because if you see all the developed markets and all the other countries which have emerged in sports, they have emerged by being multi-sport nations. So if you look at, say, the example of Australia, they're a multi-sport nation. They are either world champions or close to being world champions in multiple sports. If you look at America, the same is the case there. If you look at a lot of Western European countries, it's also the case there. So, and coming home to Asia, if you look at the example of China, they're also a multi-sport country. So, until and unless you have a focus which is different from one sport and is focusing on other areas and other multiple sports as well, you cannot have a sports ecosystem which is thriving and which is offering opportunities for everyone to grow. So, in a way, if you look at the growth of sports and sports law in India, while sports will teach you the aspect that winner takes all, in a different way, sports law will also teach you, and sports will also teach you the value of collaboration. Because until and unless you make the pie bigger for everyone, the take home is not as big for everybody else. So, sports may teach you to be pushing yourselves to the limit, but sports at the same time will also teach you the value of teamwork. And that is exactly what is critical for sports law and for the sports ecosystem to come about and thrive in a manner which it should, so that India can be elevated to the next level. Now, in this regard, let me just speak to you a little bit about how sports in India has grown and how sports in India is something which we interact with and how we respond to sports. Now, you'd see that sports in India is not just restricted to people going out and playing sports. Sports in India is also a reflection of how we see ourselves as a country and how sports in India represents an opportunity for us to see sports and to push sports in a manner where we visualize that sports can offer some kind of international standing or some kind of international branding for us. Now, India is not alone in doing it. It's seen across the world, just in different manners, which is why if you'll see some of the most consumed events when it comes to televised sports is the English Premier League. And in the English Premier League, people who are invested in it, broadcasters who are invested in it, and there are countries which are invested in it, which is why you'll see that one of the successful teams, I wouldn't say the most successful because they're not and I don't support them, Arsenal, you'll have their sleeve sponsors saying visit Rwanda. And for Rwanda, that kind of coverage is not possible in any other form, so they're paying a premium, but when they're paying a premium, every weekend or for most weekends in a year, you'll find that for at least 1 hour or 2 hours, you have players running around with their sleeves proudly showing visit Rwanda. Now, how many of us in a different setup would ordinarily think about visiting Rwanda? Probably very few. But because we are seeing this on Arsenal sleeves and Arsenal jersey sleeves, it's a thought which is crossing our mind. So what sports sponsors are seeing is that this is a captive audience which is available for me. If I pay this kind of premium and if I pay this kind of money, then I can attract that viewership attention, and that viewership attention down the line would end up becoming a revenue spinning opportunity for me. So at every step of the way, there are multiple actions which are going towards generating the final end product. And that's true for any sports contract, or that's true in fact for any commercial contract, that you're paying certain amount of consideration and in return you're expecting something to achieve out of it. So in this regard, when we're looking at sports, one of the core areas which you need to be focusing on, and some of the core things you need to be focusing on, are contracts. Because contracts will offer you an insight into what different parties are thinking and how they are approaching the entire situation. So that's something which I would encourage you to do, that when you're looking at any kind of sports transaction, or you're looking at any kind of transaction, just think, what is the object here, what is the consideration here, and what is the purpose here? So these are questions which, if you ask yourself, would invariably lead you to the answer in this regard. Now, just moving forward and focusing a little bit of attention on what are the other subject areas which you'll find form a crucial part of the sports ecosystem, you'd notice that some of the most interesting things that form part of the sports discussion or the sports ecosystem are intellectual property rights and their labor rights or employment rights. Now, intellectual property rights, a lot of us have a great amount of exposure to it, that teams will do anything and everything to promote their identities, and their identities are promoted by them investing in particular kinds of team names, in particular kinds of logos, in particular kinds of apparel, etc., etc. And they will aggressively do each and everything to capture it in a manner which furthers their commercial identity. But at the same time, there is a lot of thought which goes behind it, and it can't be something which is done in isolation. So for instance, you could have a certain thing which is making a lot of sense at a particular time when it is brought into play, but down the line it could become absolutely obsolete, or for that matter it could become, to the contrary, absolutely offensive. Now let me give you an example here, and I'll then correlate it to the Indian setting. One of the cases which garnered a lot of attention is that in American sports you had some of the teams which were named in a manner which, when they were, was not considered as offensive, or was still considered probably something which is conventional and something which is routine, but it is now extremely problematic, and you'd see a lot of backlash and a lot of change which has been necessitated by it. So some of the teams which are there, Washington Redskins, Cleveland Indians, these are teams which are probably using racial markers, and they're using that in a manner which is derogatory. So at the time when these teams secured their names, nobody really paid attention to it, or even if they did, and I'm not saying at that point in time people did not feel aggrieved by it, but the kind of scrutiny which they're receiving today has compelled them to take a lot of corrective steps in that regard, because you have to be very mindful of cultural markers when you're going about in that regard. So just now correlated to the Indian example. Now, if supposing a team were to be naming themselves as, say, the Rajasthan Rajputs, or for that matter, if they were to be naming them as Delhi Dalits, etc., at a particular point in time, there will be conversations which are to be had that can you be using sport to further caste identities, or can you be using sport to glorify certain things and
to show certain things in a different light. And let me go back to the US example. When they started facing these criticisms, these teams did not willingly decide that, okay, yes, we will roll back our names, because there are several commercial considerations involved. Teams over decades have spent their time, they have spent a lot of money, they have put in a lot of investment, they have devoted several hours to cultivating that identity. And to erase that identity under public pressure would still entail and would still involve a lot of steps which move towards a different direction. So when these teams were challenged for their names, their first defense was through IPR by saying that, look, these names were within the knowledge and within the consideration of the government at that point in time, the government-controlled trademark registry. And they found it appropriate to offer us this approval. Now, why is it that under public scrutiny we should change our names? Because there will be public scrutiny at different points in time which may be unwelcome, but every act of public scrutiny cannot necessarily result in people taking steps to change their identities. Because if you start doing it, then there is a slippery slope argument to be made that you have bowed down to public pressure to change at this particular point in time. And if you face a certain amount of further public pressure, you take another step to again change your identity. So there is a huge amount of fluidity which comes into play, and it does not in any manner ensure that you're able to cultivate and build upon an identity. So this happened in the US. And the first round of litigation which happened against these names, those litigations ended up in favor of the teams, because it was said that no, we will not succumb to this amount of public pressure. It was only later when this public pressure became magnified and there was a further greater amount of emphasis which was put on it, that you cannot get away with these kind of racial profiling names, that they did succumb to it or they did change their names. And that cost them a lot of money. So for a team which had spent a lot of money in this regard to cultivate a corporate identity for themselves, to create a loyal fan base, for them to change their entire identity was again a case which resulted in a lot of investment which was done having one particular markers in mind getting transformed due to certain other variables coming into play. Which is why now when you look at sports names which come about, the thought process is that will this name survive not only this particular generation, but for generations to come. And you have to make a very conscious choice that you cannot be choosing names in a particular manner which down the line will become obsolete or which down the line will become offensive. Which is why teams sometimes will choose names that may not necessarily excite you, but they'll choose names which they're thinking will not result in adverse legal consequences going forward. So that's again something which indicates that what is it behind the naming, which is behind the branding, which is behind the entire identity creation. And this is where intellectual property rights become extremely critical, and they offer us great guidance on what is to go forward. So that's one. The second branch of law which you'll find having a very crucial intersection with sports law is that relating to labor and employment rights. Now, very often you'll find that there is a huge mismatch in what the employers want to offer and what the employees want. to secure. And this is not just true for sports, it's true across the world. No one, or at least extremely few people, have gotten up today and said that, yes, my boss is the most wonderful person. That just does not happen. There'll always be a certain amount of friction. And that friction is seen in a manner which goes about the fact that who gets how many rights and how do these rights compete with each other. So in India, if we look at this, it hasn't really taken off in the manner where it has for other sporting nations such as the US, or for that matter Western Europe, Australia, etc., etc. And that's due to one critical reason. The reason behind that is that in India, sports at the moment is not entirely unionized. Whereas in foreign nations, especially in America, you'll find that there are huge player unions and extremely powerful player unions which are operating as a counter check on the regulators, on the organizers. So that's one very crucial distinction. And I'll offer you an example to understand as to what is at play here. Now in India, the most popular sport is cricket. And the most popular annual sporting event happens to be the IPL. If the Cricket Players Union becomes so strong or takes a shape wherein they're advocating for player rights in a very strong and assertive manner, then you'll find that the balance which exists between the regulator and the players shifts to a great extent. And let's look at the IPL. If the player union is strong and if they feel that there is an event or there is a federation which is not paying them their rightful share in terms of commerce, then they can use their bargaining power to hold the federation accountable. So to give an example, this again depends on the entire forces of market, how much demand exists, how much supply exists. But let's look at the case where there are about 10 teams which have 25 players, so 250 elite players which we're looking at. And if these 250 elite players are unionized, and these 250 elite players through their union enter into collective bargaining agreements with the federations, which speak about the fact that these are safety protocols which need to be put in place. These are rest protocols which have to be put in place. These are travel protocols which have to be put in place. It can't be that the federation simply says, okay, we're not listening to any of it. This is a take it or leave it contract. Either you do it or we'll find a replacement. Because what will happen then? When the event is close to happening, it is at that point in time that the player union has the maximum amount of leverage with themselves. And when they have the maximum amount of leverage, it's something which the federations worry about. Because if 3 days before the event is to begin, and the player union says that, look, sorry, you have not agreed with us, you have not fulfilled any of our legitimate demands, we are going on strike, then at that particular point in time, the entire commercial viability of the product is absolutely at stake. And that is something which is, in India, if you look at this situation, a zero IPL year will probably be absolute disaster, because there are so many commercial contracts which are at play, there's so many events and so many lives which are dependent on it, that this kind of commercial disaster would expose all these stakeholders to unlimited legal suits or lawsuits, law actions against themselves. The flip of that is that if the federation becomes so strong that it's calling all the shots, then the federation can keep pushing the players into a corner, and if the players are not agreeing, then one, the federation can simply replace them with another set of elite players. Or the federation can opt for a slightly different course of action, which is known as a lockout. That the federation says, we are not organizing the event because the players are refusing to align with our expectations. And even a lockout has several kinds of commercial impacts on it, associated with it. So in this regard, we have to associate and we have to be very mindful of the fact that if you offer any kind of party an upper hand to an extent where they're calling all the shots, then the consequences of that can be felt quite acutely. So in India, the next step which is perhaps to be taken is that players which are currently stars in their own right come together on a platform wherein they think about collective bargaining agreements, because their strength lies in numbers, their strength doesn't lie in individualism. So that's again something which in team sports is an area which you'll find becoming an area of focus. And who will secure advantage in it? Who will be the first movers in it? People who are service law experts, people who are labor law experts, people who are employment law experts, coupled with the fact that who have an understanding of the sports sector. You cannot simply get up, say that I'm going to be a sports law expert and I'm going to be the person who is going to advise any and everybody when it comes to all these related issues. Because come to think of it, who is going to come to you? They're going to come to you when they know that you're a lawyer of outstanding merit, you're a lawyer of great capability, you're a lawyer with great intelligence, and you have an understanding of the sports sector. So that's the way to go about when it comes to establishing yourself in the sector. And now I'll just move on to one small part before I hand over the mic. Now, think of sports law and think of sports in a manner wherein you're not necessarily just looking at what is happening on the field, because there are several things which happen on the field that are shaped by things which are happening off the field, and the off the field actions sometimes determine what is happening on the field. So for instance, and probably the best example of it is what has happened in the past 2 or 3 weeks when it comes to the Asia Cup, where India took part, so did Pakistan. And you have to look at the fact that what were the considerations which came about in this, that India did agree to take part. India has maintained a policy that we are not going to have any kind of bilateral sporting engagement, particularly bilateral cricketing engagement with Pakistan, because we don't want to offer them this kind of an avenue. We don't want to have this kind of people-to-people exchange, and we want to take a strong stance in saying that we will not engage with countries that are hostile to us openly. But if you look at it in a different way, India's hand in participating in this tournament was forced by international considerations. Because for multilateral events, which are obviously not one-on-one, but having different participating teams, for multilateral events, the rules are extremely clear. If you do not participate in something, then it's treated as a forfeit, it's treated as a walkout, and the points and the rights for that are simply awarded to the other person. So you may have a very strong moral argument to be made, but at the end of the day, sports does not care about feelings. It just does not. You can use sports to advance your feelings, but the results on the sports field do not care about feelings. That's the one ground reality. And India has utilized sports in several ways to sometimes further its international policy. The most critical or the most nuanced example where India took a very strong stance when it came to sports and when it came to international relations happened about 50 years ago, and it was in the 1975 Davis Cup final. India was playing against South Africa. South Africa, a nation which was openly practicing apartheid, and India had made it all the way up to the finals, and this was a legendary Indian team in its own rights. We've probably never seen an Indian team as great as that afterwards. And the Indian team, when it had the finals, it said, we are not going to play the final against South Africa because South Africa practices apartheid and India does not stand for apartheid. India stands against racial discrimination. The stance was extremely bold, but at the same time, India paid a price for it. That India, in that regard, forfeited the Davis Cup. And a walkover win was awarded to South Africa. So there was a case to be made that while this was a very strong show of principled opposition, another show of principled opposition could have been that you take part in it and then use that as a platform to make your point in a different manner. That you say that we have competed and yet we stand with the oppressed. But at this particular point in time, please keep in mind that the regulators or the federations have very strong views on what is considered political speech and what they consider outside the realm of sporting events or acceptable sporting conduct. So in this regard, you'd find that any kind of political speech which comes about within the realm of sport is clamped down very, very heavily with an extremely heavy hand. So you can look at the cases where there have been countries and there have been teams which have taken a strong stance in political matters and used sports platforms for it, and yet they have been sanctioned by the sporting federations. Examples could be as recent as the fact that there are players who have worn apparel and who have carried insignia in support of Palestine and to oppose the kind of actions which are taking place in Gaza by Israel. And that again has invited sanctions upon themselves. There have been cases in football wherein FIFA and other continental bodies have taken steps against Argentina when Argentina has said that the Falkland Islands belong to us. And they have taken those steps to clamp down and to indicate that these kind of sporting policies or these kind of political speeches within sports have no place in sports. So it's a very difficult tightrope to be walked. So which is why a lot of people who were in support of India's boycott said that India could have taken no other step, because even if India competed and won, and India then used that sports platform to attract more attention to the atrocities which were happening, India would still have ended up getting punished in it. But at the same time, please also keep in mind that sports federations are also governed by their own particular political considerations. So there is a case to be made and there is an argument to be made that they condone certain kind of political speech when it comes to sports merely because it suits their own particular viewpoint. And I'll give you an example of this and I'll conclude at that. If you look at the EPL, the English Premier League, every season at a particular point in time, you'll have teams which are wearing these small poppy emblems on them. And it is said that we are remembering the war heroes who fell during that particular point in time. Now, those war heroes were only war heroes for a particular set of people. They were still aggressors for a different set of people. So merely because it aligns with the Federation's interest in showing sports and political actors in a particular way, you'll find that certain kinds of political speech is condoned and certain kinds of political speech is not condoned. So this again is a part of sports and is a part of sports policy which is governed by who is at the driving seat, who is calling the shots. Because ultimately, please also keep in mind that the people who are calling the shots are also humans at the end of the day. They're also people who are advancing their own particular set of interests. And the element of neutrality, which is so often championed, is not often displayed in the same manner or with the same kind of uniformity which you'd expect. Because it could be one view to say that all kinds of political speech is bad and sports will have no role to associate with it. But as soon as you start making exemptions and creating exceptions, then it results in a situation where you're letting somebody else judge as to what is the justification for this exception and whether this exception is permissible or not, whether it advances the cause or it does not advance the cause. And this is where all of your training in jurisprudence will come to the fore, and your experience with statutory interpretation will come to the fore, because you'll understand that when a particular statute is drafted, when a particular legislation is created, and when it's passed, what are the objects and reasons behind it. And with your training in law, you'll be able to understand as to how they're able to put forth certain agendas, how they're able to advance certain causes, and how they're able to invisibilize certain causes. So these are all things which you, when look at critically, will offer a great insight to you. So to end it, I'll again, at the sake of repetition, conclude by saying that when you're looking at sports law, please look at law across various disciplines with an understanding of the sports sector, because that's the surest way for you to excel and to thrive in this particular branch of law. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
The privilege of asking the first question, of course, comes here. So, we talked a little bit about politics and sports. I mean, touched upon it, and one of the things I think all of us are, probably very curious to know in some way or the other is that when you look at sports federations, organizations across the world, are there many other countries where political parties and politicians are so deeply entrenched in the sector? Which is to say, let's say you think of, the hockey federation or the cricket or wherever. I mean, in India, you do have political parties, politicians which are, deeply involved in it, right? Is that the case in, say, China maybe, because you'll have Communist Party officials of various kinds, but then, most sports people would also be members of the Communist Party. But say in European countries or the United States are, various parties, Labour Party or the Democratic Party or Democratic Socialist Party, etc. Are their officials also so deeply integrated into these federations?
Thank you for the Okay. Thank you for the question. Now, just to answer it, in the level and in the manner where we see it happening in India, we don't see it happening in other countries. A notable exception in this regard is definitely Germany, wherein their sports is almost entirely funded and has a great amount of fan involvement. So their football clubs have a great amount of fan ownership, etc., etc. But if you look at other countries, say America, etc., etc., you won't find that actively the politicians are governing it, but you'll find that the team owners have very strong political leanings, etc., etc., because it's almost impossible in this regard to have successful, thriving businesses without there being any kind of pressure or any kind of expectation that you remain politically neutral. Because the person who is there, who's governing the entire political setup, they always have an expectation that through these sporting events which offer captive audiences, you have certain kind of political messaging being pushed through. So in that regard,
Outside professional sports, I mean, we're talking about, say, when, the England football team or, the rugby team, etc. I mean, that is outside professional sports, right? But do we have politicians part of, an integral part of the National Association of, England or whatever?
so it's less common. It's definitely less common there, but you definitely have that a lot of these teams which are taking part, and especially in England, I can say because I look at that much more closely and I follow English football, you'd find that there are particular teams which are generally associated with a particular sports leaning. So for instance, if you see Liverpool matches, then Liverpool has had a very strong lean, and I'm a Liverpool fan, so they have had a very strong leaning against the Tories and in favor of the Labour Party. So at that particular point in time, at any given Liverpool game, of course the cameras don't focus on it, but you'll find that there will be placards which say Tories out or Conservatives out. So you'll find that, and there are political reasons for it. There are also sometimes sporting reasons for it, because if a team feels that in a particular time of crisis, etc., the government has not stood up for them, then that gets amplified due to these reasons. So yes, it does happen to a great extent.
Okay, questions from the audience? Just a minute.
Thank you, Shivam, for this very interesting talk on a topic that very little is known, at least by the general public, among whom I count myself. I have two very small questions. One is regarding the status of sport litigation in India at the moment. Would you say that the major part of this litigation relates to individuals, or does it relate to organizations and federations, the status at the moment? And the second small question is, when decisions of international sporting bodies like the Olympic Organizing Committee or whatever are to be challenged, what is the legal forum in which such challenge takes place?
So I'll answer the first question first. The major litigation which is taking place at the moment in India is against the federations, and most of it is against the fact that elections within federations are not conducted properly. Or you'll find that people are challenging the aspect that there are certain occupants within federations who have exceeded age limits, who have exceeded tenure limits, and there are rival factions which are fighting it out to ensure that one particular set of people go out and the other set of people come in. So the major litigation which exists is against federations, and particularly elections, because even when it comes to courts, they're not very keen to interfere with the fact that selection trials have not taken place. X cricketer has been selected for the team and Y cricketer hasn't. They say that we are not experts in it, so we're not going to interfere with it. We'll defer to the view of sporting federations and sporting experts in it. But when it comes to their electoral practices, the courts are very, very keen to examine it because they often feel that these sports federations have certain kinds of people who are governing them for several years, if not decades, and therefore they want to put them under judicial scrutiny to examine whether that position has been occupied correctly or has not been occupied correctly. So that's the first question. The second question is regarding the actions of federations and before which particular forum that can be challenged. Now, it depends on the forum, but it depends on the federation, but very often you'd find that the decisions of the federations are first challenged before the federation's judicial bodies themselves. So for instance, if you look at, say, FIFA, if you have a dispute between different stakeholders within FIFA, they'll first go to the FIFA dispute resolution chamber, and usually that settles the matter. But if you're still dissatisfied with it, then the opportunity to challenge it further goes before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is situated in Lausanne, Switzerland, and treated as effectively the Supreme Court for sports. But then again, decisions of the Court of Arbitration for Sport can further be challenged before the Swiss Federal Court, which is the equivalent of the Switzerland Supreme Court. So yes, those are the legal routes for challenge which exists in this regard.
So actually, Pushkar sir asked half of my question already, but still I'll just twist the question and present it again. So this is regarding the politicians who govern the bodies of different sports authorities, which is very sad because they don't know sports and they are governing it. Actually, a sports person should govern. Now, is there any law in across world which restricts their powers, which says that only sportsmen can be on those chairs, on those positions, so that can be a model, since our constitution also was inspired by various constitutions across world. So is there any law which is model law in any country which can be employed by India to restrict this political interference in our sports authorities?
So thank you. In fact, that's something which has been debated and which has been now a subject matter of legislation. Earlier, there was no sort of requirement to even have sports persons within it, but now with the new legislation coming about, there are certain quotas which are reserved for sports persons of eminence within these sporting bodies. But at the same time, there is a case to be made either way, that who are better equipped to run these sports administration bodies. So our experience with politicians has been absolutely woeful, wherein we found that politicians who have never held a bat or who have never bowled or who have never kicked a football have gone ahead and become these sports administrators. But there is a case to be made that even sports persons of eminence, while they might be extremely good at understanding the nuances of sport, they're not very equipped to handle everything else which is associated with sports, which a person with an administrative background can offer. So for instance, just to give you an example, the current All India Football Federation was previously helmed by political persons. It had been Mr. Priyaranjan Das Munshi, it had been Mr. Praful Patel, etc., etc. A lot of people weren't happy with it. And the current AIFF president happens to be someone who is a former India player, Mr. Kalyan Chaubey, and people at the same time aren't very happy with him either. So there is a case to be made that if you have just one kind of people running it and not the other kind of people, then you sometimes have a very narrow focus which is developed in it, and therefore you'd probably need both sets of people, because a sports person of eminence can be extremely great at identifying young talent, but at the same time may not be the most suited person when it comes to identifying how to ensure maximum ticketing revenue at a particular game, or how to secure government permissions in the shortest possible turnaround time to organize sporting events. And also I must add a disclaimer that I regularly appear against the AIFF, so my view of them isn't a very great one. So please take that with a pinch of salt.
But I suppose that's why sports management or sports administration is also emerging along with sports law as, an area to specialize in. Next.
Sir, we heard you mention about political boycott of different countries, especially by India of South Africa, right? So what happens is when it's a country, a federation, or there's particular players, or there's a community exposing or intruding the boycott of anything, for example, it's proliferated, it's accepted. However, when it's athletes themselves doing it, for example, recent warning on Moeen Ali for wearing a Save Palestine, Free Palestine armband during the BCCI, during the IPL, that is censored. So don't you think that India is holding on to a very big double standard when it comes to political expression, especially when it's from the federation, the power holders versus from the athletes?
So yes, I do agree with you that when it comes to the fact that how political speech and how political actions within sports are to be seen, then you'd say that there are certain elements of hypocrisy which exist. So for instance, there are counter arguments to be made that India, while it, just to come back to the Asia Cup, that India, while it did opt for this no handshake policy, which was completely different from the other situation, a different way to have approached it could have been wearing a black armband, which would have attracted attention, or could have been that observing a moment of silence, which is also something which even the other side could not have said no. Because look at it differently. If a match is happening and somebody is saying that we'll observe a minute of silence for people who were martyred in Pahalgam, and if Pakistan, which is supposedly behind it, or is quite likely behind it, they say that no, we're not going to do it, then it shifts the burden upon them to show that why are you not observing a moment of silence for people who have been murdered in it. So there's a case that you did not shake hands, you wanted to limit your engagement, but a different way to go about it could have been that you embarrass them in a different way, that say that we will not go ahead with the match until a moment of silence is observed, and if you don't want to observe it, we'll still observe it. What is it that you can do to prevent it? So it's again sport which can be utilized in a different way to put people or put countries under pressure, but it obviously needs everyone to be in sync with each other. But to answer your question directly, yes, I do agree that there are extreme amounts of double standards which exist, and that mostly exists due to the fact that players do not have the same kind of leverage or the same kind of bargaining position as the federations when it comes to regulating and governing it.
So my question is that can sports journalism in India aid the enforcement of sports law by bringing transparency in cases like whichever scandals are there, or like contractual disputes, if they are brought to light through journalism, can it aid in any way?
Yes, I think it can, because if sports journalists, or for that matter any kind of journalists, are putting people under pressure by say focusing on things that are going wrong, and they're bringing it to the public's eye, then of course it can be done by ensuring that there is greater accountability. We also have to look at the absolute flip of it, that sometimes journalism or sometimes scrutiny in any manner is utilized to put an inconvenient viewpoint further, and that can also be utilized as some kind of coercive tactics. So it needs to be seen very carefully that who is behind it, what is the story behind it, whether it's been done with any kind of partiality or whether there is any oblique purpose. But yes, to answer your question, sports journalism, when it asks critical questions, when it puts these questions to the fore, and when it makes an effort to hold people accountable, there is a gain to be made by everyone, and not just sports law, but sports in general benefits from it.
Okay, while I wait for someone to make up their mind about the next question, what's the most trivial case that you have handled in sports law?
The most trivial happened quite recently. There was, I won't name the teams involved, but a person was sent off for a particular instance, and it's absolutely clear from all visual angles that the person was sent off legitimately, but they absolutely were insistent about the fact that this is a huge conspiracy theory which is running against them, and because the federation does not want to see them succeed, therefore it's happening. And I had to spend more time counseling them than the entire time for which they were suspended. Ultimately, they decided not to opt for the case, but yes, that was the case. Yes.
Do students here have a course in sports law? Is it part of your curriculum? How many of you think you are interested in sports law? It's all right, I can't even see your faces, so I only see hands, which is fine, But everyone is into football, I guess. Right? Okay, we'll take at least a couple of questions. We have time for that. Just.
Hi Shivam, excellent presentation, thank you. My question is, do you have a special court for sport cases like we have for NGT for environmental cases? Do you have one, and if you don't, do you need one?
So to answer it, at the moment we do not have it. The sports cases which are there for the federation, some actions are challenged before the federation's own judicial bodies, some which are different in terms of sports elections, etc. They're mostly challenged before the high courts of different places. A large part of them go before the Delhi High Court because either the sports ministry or the federation headquarters are situated in Delhi, so they end up going there. But there is a tribunal which is envisaged by the new act, which is the National Sports Governance Act, that has envisaged that a new sports tribunal will be set up, and all cases from different high courts will be transferred to it. Now we're waiting and seeing as to, as is the case in any tribunal, who will be the chairperson, and when that chairperson is appointed, then everyone will take a call whether it's something which they're hopeful that the tribunal will expedite their cases, and if not, then people will try and find workarounds that we keep approaching the high courts.
And appeals from the tribunal will go to the Supreme Court?
Yes, Supreme Court, not the High Court.
There was a case in Delhi of Member of Parliament Brijmohan Singh for some sexual advancement. Whether the case is over or it is behind the carpet or it is going on. What is it?
The case is still going on, sir. It's going on before one of the trial courts in Delhi. Now, for when it comes to members of parliament and members of legislative assemblies, there are special courts which have been set up, which take up cases on an expedited basis. But even that expedited basis is not very, very quick. So it's still going on. It'll take a few years before it's resolved.
Can I ask one? Yeah, is there a case to be made, one very particular thing? Like, I believe that in the sports ecosystem, we need everything, including infrastructure. Like, the current infrastructure in Goa was kept aside for Khelo India. Yeah, it's fine, it's a good thing. But the entire local population suffered and still suffers for access to the same facilities, which is used by a handful of people. Yeah, otherwise, before Khelo India, the entire Goa population was using that infrastructure, like say the swimming pool. The swimming pool was also closed for a couple of years, and now the work done is pathetic. Yeah, very bad infrastructure is now there. Is there a case to be made here?
So, the argument in terms that whether there should be access to sporting facilities limited to elite levels or to a very high professional level, or should it be done at a larger public level and offer access to most people who are keen to it, that's definitely an argument to be made. Different states and different countries have opted for different trajectories. Some have opted for the fact that certain kinds of sporting facilities will only be offered to targeted groups, to elite levels, to professionals, and certain other places have offered or have opted for a completely different route, that until and unless you encourage public participation at a greater level, you will not have a greater amount of interest being built. And if that particular person or that particular target group does not achieve the result, then you've lost years in the process and you have not built the next generation of talent. So it's entirely a question of who is governing the sports administration at that point in time, but there are arguments to be made on either side in that regard, sir.
We are already like members of that facility, and the live members are not given access.
Sir, in your particular case, I don't know the specifics, and again, it won't be great commercial sense for me to be advising without fees, sir.
Excuse me, what is the size of the litigations or the business? Because most of the young people would like to see corporate things happening. It goes into thousands of crores. Except for IPL, the cricket, is it going to be a very large business because you've entered into this territory in India? So I'm sure it must be. So can you just share that, please?
So cricket is undoubtedly the absolute #1 sport in the country, and there's no close second to it. But the fastest growing sport in terms of viewership is Kabaddi in India, because it's telecast, and they've also chosen or made a conscious decision that they'll not necessarily only target the metropolitan cities, but they'll also target some other cities and some other emerging cities. So in that regard, what is happening is that because these cities do not necessarily host sporting events on a daily or sort of a weekly basis, when Kabaddi is happening, there is a huge amount of on-ground involvement and on-ground attraction for it, and that results also in ensuring that there is a loyal fan base which is developing within those cities, and that is also pushing for a great amount of viewership engagement on television. So for instance, I can speak for the example of Patna. I'm originally from Bihar. The fact that Patna Pirates has been set up and they have been successful for a few years in Kabaddi has really ensured that Kabaddi as a sport has been embraced by all of Bihar, and it has ensured great amounts of viewership for it, which is a huge positive in that regard, sir. So It's difficult to say because individual athletes, etc., don't usually opt for court cases unless it's a do or die case, because their shelf life or their athletic playing life is of a limited duration. If you're an elite athlete, then it could maybe be 15 years plus, and court cases in India are notorious for dragging on for a really long time, so they don't usually opt for it. But when it comes to federations, all these federations are at the center of legal cases. And in the Delhi High Court, where I practice, for instance, in any given year, there are at least 100 to 150 cases which are filed against federations for any kind of electoral malpractice or any kind of administrative law related lapse. So yes.
So I actually have two small questions. One, that is, now sports and the offences which happen here, they may have different laws which it coincides with, like contract law, for example. So for them, should they have separate courts, like how ma'am asked? Like specifically when it comes to this posh matters and all, should there be separate courts for sports related for the athletes? And secondly, when it comes to child athletes and there are matters of POXO or POSH, should they have a different legislation considering the different types of sports and all? Should there be a different legislation for the safety of the child athletes, and should there be a different code? Yeah, for specialized sports, specifically addressing the given sport and how the offense may happen. For them, is there a need for legislation too, separately?
So I'll answer the second question first, that whether there should be a specialized law which deals with child athletes and relating to it. I personally feel that the overall parent legislation, which is POXO, should exist in its current form. You should not have exceptions which are created in that regard, and you should not have situations where just because a sector is unique in some way that you should have different legislations for it, because what will happen is that if you start creating and moving along these exceptions, then there is no stopping. Today it would be sports which is there. Tomorrow it could be something else which is considered to be a situation where this is happening and you would want to create it. And by doing it, you end up weakening the parent legislation. So I'm not in favor of creating exceptions for it. And the second question, or rather your first question, which relates to the fact that whether there should be a specialized court and whether children within it should have a specialized sub-forum within it. Again, I think that the existing system is strong enough and there are certain protections which are offered to minor athletes or to children in this regard. So for instance, when cases involving children come up for anti-doping related issues, their names are redacted. It is just shown as XYZ, etc., so that their identities aren't revealed. But having a specialized sub-forum for minor athletes, I don't think that would be a great way to go about it. Yes.
So my name is Sankal Pargaonkar from VM Sagar College of Law. I have two questions, okay, coupled. Again, I have two questions, basic simple questions. Many times when selection happens, selection takes place, the criteria is not always shown to the players. They have not shown to them what was the criteria selecting someone or rejecting someone. Is there any law regarding that, and how many times they are being challenged on this particular premises in the court in our country? Second question is that many times in normal cases we see that execution of court's order, there is many problems with that. Execution always becomes delayed. Recently we have seen the case of Churchill brothers. They were refused to give the trophy, though they were declared they are not winners. So how is the execution in this area of law, which is sports area?
So for the second question, I'm sorry I won't be able to answer it. I've represented Churchill brothers in many cases, including this particular season, so I'm sorry I just can't answer it. For your first question relating to the fact that how do we go about it
in this manner, then I think there is a different argument to be made, because if you just look at how sports is operating in this particular regard, then you'll find that it's very difficult to look at it in absolutely neat compartments. There are very often certain overlaps which happen, and in that particular context you'd see again that these enforcements or any kind of other actions which take place, they will invariably have an impact on other areas. So there will be certain kinds of overlaps or certain kinds of situations where you don't necessarily see it proceeding in the manner in which you're suggesting. And I'll answer that with a particular example. For certain sporting events, it can be seen, such as equestrian, wherein you have particular scientific markers that if the animal can jump so high and if you can clear these many hurdles, then it can be done. But if in, say, a different sport, such as football, you may not necessarily be able to measure whether a free kick will curve at this particular angle or can necessarily travel at this kind of speed. So there is a huge overlap in terms of subjective elements, and those necessarily can't be subjected to judicial review. So it's a difficult call to be made, and because there are overlaps with other fields, sometimes courts usually do not enter into these areas, which is why when it comes to sporting selections, judicial interference is extremely low unless you can show that something absolutely glaring has happened. But when it comes to sporting elections, then yes, because there is a neat procedure which is laid down, there can be a greater amount of scrutiny placed on it. Yes.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, Shivam. I have one specific question. How do you see these cooling periods which have been drafted by the sports bills or Justice Lodha, who had come with these cooling periods? Because, see, in cricket, when Justice Lodha had come with this cooling period, he says no office bearer can continue after a period of 6 years or 2 terms of 3 years. Now, what happens is the moment you are elected as a fresher, to understand all the functioning of the association or a federation, it takes you 3 years. By the time you become, get the experience, another term goes by 6 years. And by the time you get experience, then you are out in cooling period. So how do you see this? Because I also agree with what you said. The best of as you say, most of the people say, or most of the mindset is all these sports associations should be headed by the players and all, which I do not agree, because the best of the player cannot become a best of the coach or a best of the captain. Because if you see BCCI, we had the president, a lovely president, who have taken BCCI to a different height. They were neither a player, but they were good administrators. Because what you require as the chairman of the federation or a chairman of the association, they have to be a good administrator who can understand the business, because there are a lot of contracts to be discussed, advertising rights to be discussed. While I agree this, I also agree there has to be a mix of both administrators and the players. How do you see this?
So, vis-a-vis the question of cooling period, it's a heavily contested and a hotly debated topic. I'm personally in favor of cooling period. I know there is an argument to be made, and in fact, when the recent AIFF case was argued in the Supreme Court, a set of recommendations were made by Justice Ellen Rao's commission, which was the draft constitution in question, that you need to have cooling off periods, and there were certain arguments to be made saying that, in opposition to it, saying that again, by the time you acquire experience, and if you want Indian sport to compete globally and to secure global footing, then you should not have it in this manner, because
for other federations, you'll find that people who are going ahead and becoming continental heads, they have already served for about 20 years in their federations and then gone on to secure these positions, because you have built institutional memory, you have built that memory in this regard. And the Supreme Court arrived at a via media of sort of middle path where it said that we believe this cooling period should operate, and until and unless the international federation has a different cooling off period, this should exist. So if you're looking for a middle path, the middle path can be that if the international federation or the continental federation has a cooling off period, or does not have a cooling off period and offers continuous terms, then yes, do go for it. My personal view is, and guided by the fact that India over several years has had sports administrators who have refused to give up their seats for other people despite age not being on their side, and therefore we've had a deficit and a gap of other trained individuals coming ahead and taking the federations forward. My personal view is that cooling off periods are necessary, and it would ensure that a wider talent pool is available, maybe if not at the national level, at least at the sports states level, where these people and their talents can be put to greater use if there is a greater talent pool which is available. Yes, that's my view, sir. Definitely, sir. If the president can have it, no, so should everyone.
Okay, okay, one last, very last question.
Shivam, I found the topic of expression of views in sports very interesting. And I just wanted to ask you two questions. Is there any way that an athlete can challenge, the censoring of something like an armband or a badge that he's wearing to express his views by saying, see, this is not unethical what I'm doing, I'm standing for something. And it's not very different from, like you said, wearing a poppy badge or wearing a black armband. Is there some way that they can say that these are the facts of the matter and what I'm doing is not unethical? And is there any law that can protect the athlete from not getting discriminated against in the next innings, like let's say in the next season?
So the law which can come to the athlete's aid, and no one's actively tried it yet, but there's a situation where it could come about, is that they could move a writ against a federation saying that if they've been sanctioned, this is in violation of their free speech right available under Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution, and their freedom to carry business, which is 19(1)(g). So at that point in time, the court will be called upon to look at the fact that whether this prohibition or restriction is a reasonable restriction under 19(2) of free speech, and whether the federation is equipped to curtail commercial speech in a manner which is consistent with 19(6), wherein it speaks about freedom to carry on trade and profession. Nobody's yet tried it, but there's a potential argument to be made. Why I don't think it will happen anytime in the near future is that athletes in general have short shelf lives or have short playing careers. So if you take a federation head on in this manner, you automatically become a scapegoat. So it will probably happen if an athlete decides that come what may, this is a matter of principle, this needs to be contested, or if an athlete is towards the end of their playing careers and they will say that, look, what is it that the federation can now do to me? Pretty much nothing. So I have pretty much nothing to lose. Let me try this and see what happens. So if that were to take place, then yes, this could come about as a challenge, but under the present situation, I do not foresee it happening, and I do hope that if this challenge comes about, I'm there somewhere
involved in this. It'll be great.
And is there any law that protects, so like after this happens and let's say they go into and they're not in they're in the middle of their career, is there any law that can protect them from, getting discriminated against in the next innings or next season?
It's extremely difficult because when they will file a writ, they'll say that this should not be a situation that results in any kind of scapegoating against me, or I should not be blacklisted, etc. And the courts at that point in time will be faced with a very difficult choice, wherein they'll say that if we offer you this kind of protection, you can effectively hold the federation to ransom by saying that, look, I'll do what I want, you can't look at me because the courts have their hands on top of me. So what will usually happen is that even if an athlete were to make an argument, and even if the judges are sympathetic, they'll end up saying, let's see, if something happens, you come back to us, we'll take care of it at that point in time. So I don't see that an immediate solution through interim orders will be available to the athlete here.
Thank you, Shivam. Before I end, very small story, and which is not meant to nudge you to give free advice to Walter, but still. So in 2018, a very young Gautam Bhatia was invited by me to give a talk. And in attendance at that time, there were about 60 members of the Goa Liquor Federation Association. The reason for them attending was, of course, a law had been passed, which was you cannot have bars. They have to be at least 500 meters from the highway or something like that. And of course, after the talk, the talk wasn't something else, I don't exactly recall, but it took about 1 hour for me to pull Gautam out of that. And what he was doing for that 1 hour was giving exactly that, free advice. Okay. Thank you, Shivam, for an excellent talk and for being very, very patient with the Q&As. And thank you to all the students who turned up and to everyone else, our trustees, members of ICG and everyone else. Thank you all.